All right, here we go again. You don't even know. So I'm going to finish up the J. Warner Wallace book, Person of Interest. I always want to say Usual Suspects because what it does is it sets up the framework for this conversation that we're having with myself regarding the canard that's always put out or often put out in certain circles that somehow science and God don't coexist. Either science doesn't prove God or science has disproved God. All the nonsense you hear from certain sectors of the scientific community, the media, most of, whom, I'm not going to say that, from a lot of different quarters. I was just listening to a podcast. Well, I guess so. That's what it was, called Side B. And I don't have any of the information of the people there, and I should if I'm going to reference it. But it's about this gal who she's really smart. You know what? I'll link to it in this thing and I want to make a note that I got to do it because if I don't make a note, then I won't do it. Link to side B. What she does is she talks to just has a conversation with people who were either, I guess there's a couple of, but basically these are really super smart people, very accomplished intellectually, who were either atheists and then became Christian because of the data, or, some of them, at least the guy I was listening to today, he started off his whole his whole life, he was, raised in a Christian home. And then he went to England. No, he lived in England, lost his faith, which happens a lot of times. People just, you get to a point where you're like, well, what am I really doing here? And then, regained it because, again, looking at the data. The common thread that I see oftentimes, and it's usually the problem of evil that really trips people up. And when I say the problem of evil, I don't really think that that's what it is, but that's what it's known by. That's the vernacular for it. So I'll go with that. But usually what will happen is that people have this idea of God being real. Then suddenly life hits you. and there are a lot of things that happen that you didn't learn on Sunday in church or at Sunday school or at your summer camp. And you're like, what the hell's going on? And you can have a couple of different reactions. It's happened to me. It happens to a lot of people. But I think what happens is, and really the reason why I'm doing this whole thing, there's like two people who ever see these things. The reason I'm doing it is because people generally think that the reality of God is based on a feeling or a belief, which is true, I think, to some extent, oftentimes. What I've discovered, or at least what it seems to me, is that God is an objective reality that is real, whether or not you believe it. Think of it this way, because oftentimes when you hear people talk about science and we've discovered this and we learned this and we disprove facts and we learn other facts, it's almost as if they're making them up as they go. Something was a fact here because this is what we believed, and then we found out 5 years later that it wasn't a fact, and we had to re-understand what facts were, those kinds of things. And they talk about facts and reality as if it's something that is made up as human beings go along. I don't think that's the way it is. I think what really is going on, it's almost like if you're driving your car down a road in a place you've never been. The road is there, right? The things that are, whether it's the woods or the city, wherever you're driving, all of the features of that place, all of the things that make up that place where you're going, they're already there. And as you drive down the road, you simply discover these things. But it's not like if you didn't drive down that road or didn't discover it, that suddenly they don't exist. They're already out there. And I think that's really what we're working with here in reality. I'm not even sure how that works. I'm trying to say that, but the point I'm making is that there is this objective reality out there. And you just kind of, as you go along, using your cognitive faculties and experience and, testing things, and you find out that it seems to be what is out there. I think the best way to understand God is, look, who's talking? Who knows? How would I know that? It seems to me the best way to understand God is that God is an objective, necessary reality, period, and start from there. Now, how I understand it, that is different. That's the thing that needs most of the work. But to go the other way around and say that God isn't real, and then try to figure out how everything works, it seems to me always fails, which is why I think natural philosophy is a very important part of understanding God, along with whatever feelings and emotions that you may have, in your church or fellowship or those kinds of things. And I think that natural philosophy is neglected, or it seems like it is, because again, one of this on the Side B podcast, this guy's brilliant, man, kind of said the same thing. He spent most of his life in the church, was confronted by some reality that was not, that couldn't be handled within the framework of his lifelong church experience, kind of blew him up. And then he started hearing these things like the ontological argument and the moral argument and, the cosmological argument, things that he had never heard before. And boy, that just seems, I want to say criminal, but criminal is not the word I want to say. But it's stunning to me because I was the same way. Never heard any of these arguments. And I was 50 before I heard anything like this. And once I started digging into it, it makes it seem like that God is the necessary reality, and everything else is just coming off of that. That seems the best way to understand reality. It seems to be. I could be wrong. What do I know? So that's why I'm doing the series on God and science, because there's a lot of knuckleheads in the academy and in the media who want to tell you that somehow science disproves God. And again, that podcast that I heard today, wasn't even thinking about it. I should play some of it. I'm going to do an episode just using that particular podcast because it illustrates so many of the things that I'm talking about right now, where you have people who are singling out people who believe in God. The incident that he talked about was where, the first day of some class in college, this biology professor has, hey, if you're a Christian, you stand up. And he says, hey, by the end of this class, you're not going to be Christians because you can't, do both of them. Well, why would you do that? Why would you make such an asshole move? Well, there's a lot of that going on in college. And so I think it's important for people to understand. And I think that if you look at the data, not just historical data, scientific data, philosophical, metaphysical data, if you look at everything that we know, all of experience and all of metaphysical, reality, is that the way to say it? I don't know what I'm talking about half the time, so forgive me if I'm going off. It seems to paint the picture that there was this necessary reality, this necessarily existing being named God. Well, he's not named God, but his name, I don't think his name has to be God, but that's what we call him. Anyway, and then once you have that, then you can have everything else. But if you don't have that, it seems impossible to have anything else. That's the way it seems. So I spent a whole lot of time. I didn't even have that scripted. You go, yeah, that's how it looked. So we'll start with, let me go over the first couple of igniters, and just to show you the framework for which for which the people had who originated this thing called science as we know it today, the scientific method and all of these discoveries. It's a fantastic book. J. Warner Wallace, person of interest. I always want to say usual suspects. Oh dear. All right, first. The first igniter was Christ's followers believed that matter was good and worthy of study. Again, that wasn't really a big deal to me, but apparently it was a big deal because obviously there was very popular philosophies during that time that matter was either evil, non-existent, or just not the essential reality. But the second one, this is one is very important. Christ's followers believe their world was the product of a singular, orderly, rational God. Now, I mentioned, and I think I mentioned this in the last thing I did, Alvin Plantinga's book, Where the Conflict Really Lies. And this is my third time through the book. It's not a tough book. I shouldn't make it out like that. It's a very readable book, and anybody who has the opportunity should read this book because it really does. He does a very good job of laying bare the fallacies of those people who tell you that science and God don't interact. They're all fallacious. What he really shows is that there's a great concord between understanding who God is, or at least believing that God is real, and conducting science. And this is what is illustrated here in this second igniter, that Christ's followers believed that their world was a product of a singular, orderly, rational God. And Alvin Plantinga's argument is really the argument against naturalism and evolution. I'm hoping to have a guest come on and explain that further. He's a philosopher guy who really understands this stuff because I don't. But what it shows is if you believe that there was a rational, singular, orderly God, it lends itself to the idea that the world should also be rational and orderly put together, rather than this random, anti-teleological process. Give myself a point. That naturalist or evolution asserts is the origin of everything you see. This, random natural selection is what they call it, this random generation of things, does not rationally lend itself to a world that is orderly. And, well, the specific argument here isn't that. The specific argument that Alvin Plantinga is making, again, hopefully the guest will come on and make the same argument, or at least illustrate the same argument, is that naturalism and evolution, you can't rationally believe both of them. It's it's not complicated, but it can be hard to understand, and I'm not quite sure I understand it, which is why I'm reading the book for the third time. But that kind of coincides with this igniter number 2, that people who believe in God believe that there was one God. He's the source of order, the source of logic and reason, and therefore his creation would be orderly, logical, and reasonably created so that you would understand it. And that's the second part. The second part of that is this idea that human beings are created in his image, the imago Dei. I think that's what it is. I probably said it wrong. But the idea that we're created in his image so that we could understand the things that he created. And again, on naturalism, there really isn't any reason to expect that we could understand the world that we are experiencing like we do. Matter of fact, there was I'm not going to find it now. I write stuff off that I'm supposed to say that I want to talk about, and then as I'm talking, things pop up that I haven't. But there's an article called, I got to find it. There's some mathematician who wrote an article about the unorderly. Basically, it says it's a miracle that we could even understand math, that we can use math to map the world. He says, in his estimation, there's no way that should be. The point I'm making is that while many people will tell you, well, you'll hear it in certain quarters, that God and science, there's a conflict. The reality is that the conflict really lies with the idea that there is no God. The first idea, I think, is eminently true. The second idea, I don't think makes any sense at all, yet it's the popular idea right now. So let's get on to the rest of these igniters. I lost my place here in the book. Number 3, Christ's followers believed that he was distinct from his creation. Jesus endorsed a worldview that described God as greater than, but distinct from his creation, working through predictable, natural processes in such a way that humans could study these processes. The view of the world allowed Jesus' followers to study and investigate their environment without simply attributing every phenomenon to an unpredictable deity. Oftentimes you'll hear the canard that God is no different from Zeus. Without even getting into the nonsense of that claim, it's a canard. The God that Christ's followers believed was real was separate from his creation, not part of the creation. And all these other gods are created beings, which gives you a different way of understanding them. Well, they're fictional too, so there's that. But if you believe they were real, it would give you a different way of understanding the world. One, if they were a created being, that yeah, Zeus did whatever he did with the lightning, or Poseidon with the water. But if you believe the Christian God, according to J. Warner Wallace, that you understand that God is separate from his creation, not part of his creation. So that what happens is part of, well, let me see what he said. He said it better, is a natural process, a predictable natural process, rather than some, God feeling his own way at the time. Igniter 4. Christ's followers were motivated by their desire to worship God, the God of the universe. This one is what struck me, and which I think is the impetus for me being so, I don't know, interested in this natural philosophy. Because again, I didn't even know that such a thing existed. Natural philosophy was the original term for science before science took it over. And what natural philosophy was the idea that you could understand God from studying the things that God made. And then, the philosophy part came into understanding how God made it, connecting this created thing to God. I guess that was the philosophy part. Here, J. Warner Wallace says, most secular scientists today are driven by their sincere love of science and discovery, which is fantastic. While this is a noble motivation, it pales when in comparison to the inspiration of early Christian scientists who saw their work as an act of divine devotion and holy worship. Now, if God and science somehow conflicted, there's no way you could get that. You couldn't get people who were engaging in scientific endeavor as an act of devotion to God. That couldn't have happened if there was some sort of a conflict. Johann Kepler, German mathematician, astronomer, and theologian who was the key figure in the scientific revolution. He's one of the geniuses. I don't know what it was that he did. I'm wondering if it was chemistry, but I don't want to say that because that may not be the thing. But Kepler, he described his work in the following manner. I was merely thinking God's thoughts after him. Since we astronomers are priests of the highest God, in regard to the book of nature, the benefits of us being thoughtful, not of the glory of our minds, but rather, above all else, the glory of God. Did I read that right? Anyway, Johann Kepler believed that his act of studying science was actually glorifying the God that he believed was real. So again, it would be impossible that science and God are somehow in conflict when you have greats like Johann Kepler saying these kinds of things. The very motivation of them making these great discoveries in science is because he thought he was glorifying God. He was understanding who God was. So again, the idea of God and science having a conflict, it's nonsense. And I mean this. Anybody who tells you it is a liar. Now, you don't want to say that, or maybe you do. I don't know. But that's the fact. Nobody would tell you that if they really understood what was going on. What's next? Igniter number 5. Christ's followers believe that they could better understand God by observing his activity in the book of nature. And this is, again, basically similar to the number 4. This is what Galileo said. The intention of the Holy Spirit is to teach us Not how one goes to heaven, but how heaven goes. The idea being is that what he understood was, again, it seems to me, I don't want to get all crazy, but it seems to me is that what he's saying is that, yeah, you've got the Bible, the Holy Spirit and the miracles that God has done, all of the baptisms and the preaching of the gospel. Those are all wonderful and powerful and necessary and amazing things. But that's basically talking to you. That's to teach you how, that's a relationship with God thing. That's teaching you how to go to heaven. That's telling you about the glory of Christ and what he did on the cross and how you can have a right relationship with God. But the second thing that they talk about was they call the book of nature. That tells you how the heavens go, meaning how all of these things work. It's all about the physical material world that God created. That's what the book of nature was about. The stars, the sun, temperature, water, chemicals, all of those things that God created is the book of nature. That tells you how the heavens go. And that's what that means. I thought that was brilliant when I read that. I had to read it a couple of times because I'm like, what is he talking about? And then, you read the rest of the book. Not here, but I read it someplace else. Number 6, Christ's followers pursued physical and intellectual investigations of their environment. This is the beginning of the science part. It says much of science in antiquity was intellectual rather than physical. Long before the word science was used to describe the endeavor, it was known as natural philosophy. Most Greeks and Romans, for example, considered manual labor fit only for slaves. If ancient scientific theories were to be tested, empirical research involving manual activity would be required. Let me see. This kind of empirical research involving physical experiments emerged quickly, however, in the earliest Christian education facilities. The University of Bologna, for example, began dissecting human cadavers regularly in the Middle Ages. This is what people sometimes will say the Dark Ages. They weren't Dark Ages. The shift from purely intellectual reasoning towards physical experimentation is unsurprising, given that many of the earliest university professors and lecturers were Christian monks who had been steeped in a tradition of physical labor and didn't view matter as inherently evil. These monks weren't afraid to get their hands dirty, and they saw empirical research as an extension of their physical work and divine duty. I'm going to leave that one alone. I think that says everything right there. Here's another one that I found very interesting. Igniter number 7, Christ's followers created a place to advance the sciences. Finally, scientific experiment and discovery blossomed when like-minded scholars and students gathered in the context of modern universities. I didn't know, and I referred to it in an earlier one of these things that I did, that it was Christian monks who created universities, places where people can get together and study the universe. So the very foundations of universities, of science, literally all intellectual endeavor regarding science seems to be, if not 100%, I guess 100% would be too much. That would be too much of a grab. But in a very, 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 very large way, impacted by Christian belief. So much so that it's not entirely clear that had not this, group of Christian believers in this particular location, in this particular time, had ever gotten together, that you would ever have science as we understand it today at all. So when some people say, and I read it in the last one, I don't have it here, but that we were 15,000 years behind, or 1,500 years behind, 15,000, 1,500 years behind. Science is 1,500 years behind because of what the Christians did. I think it's the exact opposite. I think that if it wasn't for Christians, at least if you look at the data, then we wouldn't have science at all. We wouldn't have cell phones. We wouldn't have all of these wonderful things that we have. Maybe not. Maybe that's a stretch. But in any way, there's no doubt that the origins of science as we know it, the origins of universities, as we know it today, that was a Christian thing. And so when an enlightened person comes to you and goes, hey, that's, the Christians don't know what they're doing, and we didn't really start figuring out how the world worked until we got rid of all of these religious dogmas and stuff like that, they're all full of shit. Every single one of them. It all had to do with people who believed in God and believed that their search for God or studying the world helped them understand who God was. Develop the scientific method, develop the universities where people can get together and understand it. And all of the major, I shouldn't say all, many of the major figures in science, the pioneers of science, all believe that God is real. And as I said before, 65% of Nobel Prize winners believe in God. So this idea that there's a conflict is nonsense and BS. And the only time somebody will tell you that is if they're lying to you or they're just not that smart. And I'm including all college professors who would ever say this, and YouTube folks. No, listen, I'm an idiot, so I can say that. But it's clear from the data, nothing could be farther from the truth. So I'm going to end there. That's enough of me reading and yammering on about that. You know what? I think I will give a shot. Maybe but I won't. I'm going to put that what was it? Side B podcast. You should hear about it. You should actually subscribe to this through this the Side B podcast. If you're somebody who's trying to figure out if only smart people or only dumb people believe in God, and smart people have outgrown the idea of God, that idiot comment, listen to the Side B podcast. I'm the one you look at and go, only a dummy would believe God is real. That would be me. But there's a lot of smart people out there who again, are intellectually, out there in the world doing amazing things. And yeah, they believe God exists. It's not this lie that's being told that, only dumb, scared people believe in God. You can only get that from thinking about somebody like me. So subscribe to the Side B podcast. I don't have any of the information of it right now, but it'll be in the description. Get J. Warner Wallace's book, Person of Interest. I'm going to go through one more part of his book because it's fascinating when he gets to all of the people. It's right here, and I'll put this up in this video. It's the Hall of Fame of scientists who were Christian. And when you start hearing the names, you're like, oh yeah, I know that guy. That's, Boyle. How we know the water, boiling water. Kepler, Newton. Newton is probably what people say he's the greatest physicist ever. And I don't know if it was most of what he'd written. A lot of what he was written was all theological. And then you have some knucklehead like Tyson trying to say I think he redid the Cosmos series. You're talking like, Newton, he really didn't have anything. No, Newton was a huge God guy. Huge. And he's the father of physics. So, listen, I can go on forever. I'm going to stop right here. Get the book, Person of Interest, subscribe to the podcast. What is it? Side B podcast. And subscribe to this podcast too. I guess I have to ask for it. Subscribe to the podcast. Hit the notification button. I was told to say that. And tune in next time. We'll finish up the book here with the Hall of Fame of the scientists. So thanks for watching. Yeah, that's it. All right, I'm out of here.